morning. Okay, we're on Mem Dalet Amud Beis. Sorry for the delay. I'm a little bit late today. We are at Omar Abai, about halfway down the page. First word on the line is Bishvi, a little more than halfway down the page. Mem Dalet Amud Beis, 44b. Amar Rabbi Abai says, "Ashkachtinu lechavraya d'Rav Nosson bar Harshad Yas v'Kamran." 1 second. Okay, so we were discussing how a Nazir goes to the mikvah on the Nazir Tameh. So again, he's Tameh because of Tumas Meis, right? He touched a dead body. He goes to the mikvah on the 7th day. He cuts his hair on the 7th day, and then he can bring his karbanos on the 8th day. And we said with the Mitzvah, it's a little bit different. The Mitzvah purifies himself on the 7th day, goes to the mikvah on the 7th day. He cuts his hair on the 8th day, and he brings his karbanos on the 9th day. And Reb Tarfon didn't like that, and it seems like Reb Tarfon later retracted his objection. I should say it's not clear if Reb Tarfon retracted his objection. Okay, now Abai is saying Abai is going to go through this in more detail. So he found the friends of Rav Nosson bar Harshad, they were saying the following: the Mitzvah is Bolefnei Hashem al Pesach al Ma'id. He comes before God to the opening of the Oil Ma'id of the Beis Hamikdash. When the Sanam el Kain, and he brings the karbonos to the Kain. Emasai Huba. And what's the first words of that pasuk? By Yom Hashmini, on the 8th day. So it means on the 8th day he comes and brings the karbonos. 1 second. This is not a mitzvah. This is talking about a zov. A person is a zov is tumah yotzim nagof. That means that he had a mission that causes him this type of tumah. Like we pointed out before, it's not exactly clear that the fluid of Zav exists today. Not clear that anybody today is a Zav. We certainly don't recognize it as something, there's no medical recognition that there's such a term called Zav. Okay, so if somebody's a Zav, 1 second. When does a person become a zav? So in other words, he explains as follows: he comes in front of God on the 8th day. What's significant about the 8th day? That on the 7th day he's already gone to the mikvah. So if he goes to the mikvah on the 7th day, so the 7th day he remains tamei, a tumah called tvul yom. Tvul yom means that the completion of the purity only happens once the sun sets. So we see from here that he can't bring his karbanos on the 7th day. It's only the 8th day that he's able to come before God. What's the significance of that? It must be that the Tful Yom is actually the same status as a Zav, in the case of a Zav. In other words, if he started off as a Zav, he becomes a Tful Yom, then he remains the status as a Zav. Evidently, he holds that Tful Yom of a Zav is like a Zav. Amin Elohein, and I said to them, I know Elomeyatik Nazir Tomei. My response to them was as follows: if that's the case, then let's examine a Nazir Tomei. The pasuk says, same thing. B'yom Hashmini. It says also on the 8th day he'll bring his karbonos al Pesach al Ma'id. So maybe let's say give the same logic. That also, when is he allowed to enter the temple? Only after he's already purified himself. There's just one problem. Mechti, let's examine this. In order for him to bring, so the temple, I guess, was comprised of a number of divisions, and one of those divisions, there was the building itself, and then the courtyard around it called the Azara. In order to enter the building or the courtyard around it, you had to be pure. No tum at all. However, there were other parts. There was attached to the main courtyard. There was a women's section, the Ezras Nashim, and then there was the Temple Mount, which is a much larger area. You could fit a couple of temples in the Temple Mount. That's how big it was. So the law is that a person who's tamei is allowed to walk up to and including the Ezras Nashim. He just can't walk into the temple and the courtyard. But if somebody has Tumah Yotzim and Aguf, he can't even go on the Temple Mount. And we'll explain why in a moment. Now, the front gate of the courtyard, which was in front of the temple, is called Shari Niknar. Why was it called Shari Niknar? Because there's a man whose name was Niknar, and he donated the gates. And what he donated the gates is another whole subject, another whole story. But it was a miracle. The gate was supposed to be covered with gold. Instead, it was covered with copper because it was a miracle that happened with the gates. They were being drawn by sea, and the sea was very stormy, and the gates were apparently put on the top of the boat, and they fell off the boat. So when later they found them floating. The gates were still floating, even though they were very heavy and very large gates, heavy laden with copper. So they rescued them and brought them back in the boat, and they were able to bring them. Okay. Anyway, those are the gates called Shari Niknar. Now, generally speaking, so the gates of the Azara were fairly thick. They were fairly thick, meaning so the door itself was, I don't know, maybe a couple of inches thick, however thick a door could be. Obviously, it can't be too thick because then nobody would be able to open it. But the thickness of the walls was probably 7.5 feet thick, which is not unusual because it's a brick non-concrete structure. So it's sort of, you put the widest one on the bottom, and then it gets narrower as you get to the top. So you lose about 1/2 inch for every 3 feet of stone. So it's not unusual that it should be so thick at the base. I believe it's 5 or 6 amas, so roughly 6 to 7.5 feet. Okay, that is the thickness. So the doorpost is 7 feet thick at the base. Obviously, it's narrower at the top, and the door is a couple of inches maximum. So you have a wide area. Where is the door put? Is it put in the inside or on the outside? And what's the status of in the doorway? So in general terms, the halacha is that every doorway was niskadish. The width of the width of the door, of the threshold, had the kedusha of the Azara. So obviously, where do they put the door? All the way on the outside. So this way, until the door anyone was able to be. Once you open the door, you have to be ritually pure. Tahor. Okay, this is true. There were, I believe, there were 7 or 13. I think it's 13 gates to the base of Mikdash. So I seem to recall, and all of them were like this except for the front door. Front door is called Shari Niknar. Shari Niknar was the opposite. The width of the door was not sanctified. That space. Why wasn't it sanctified? Because basically this way somebody who is tamei but needs a certain procedure of Tara could stand there and get it done. Basically Mitzvah. Mitzvah has to have his procedure done inside the temple, but he can't actually walk into the temple because he's tamei. So he sticks his hands in, and the kohen puts the blood in his hands, and it becomes Tara. Okay. So Abaye has the following question: the width of the door of the gates of Niknar was not the same sanctification as the courtyard. It was a lower level. It was considered Shari Levia. It was considered a level of tumah that a deceased, that person who's tamei meis is allowed to enter. But Tanya, we learned tamei meis mujuli kanes machna levia. The second camp, in other words, sort of if you're in a regular city, you could be tamei. There's no problem with that. But if you want to enter the Temple Mount, which is considered machna levia, you have to be pure. You have to be pure from tumah hayotzim and aguf, but from tumas meis, you're allowed to go in, like we saw. Like we see, tamei meis mujuli kanes machna levia. The tamei meis is allowed to enter the camp of the Levium. Now, obviously, the camp of the Levium was true when the Jews were in the desert. Later, it became the external courtyard of the temple. There were no Levium that lived there necessarily. Not just somebody who's tummy mace, even the dead body itself. Shenemar, the pasuk says, when all the Jews were getting all the wealth to pull out of Mitzrayim, what was Moshe Rabbeinu doing? He was taking out the bones of Yosef to go bury them. What does it mean he took them with him? It means literally right next to Moshe Rabbeinu's tent for all 40 years in the desert. There was the bones of Yosef. So evidently Yosef was always in Machna Leviah. Okay, so therefore the problem is as follows. The pasuk can't, when the pasuk says on the 8th day you can come in, or the 8th, right? It doesn't mean that until that point you couldn't come in. Because look at Nazir. Nazir, obviously he could come in. The Nazir can come up. In other words, technically speaking, we would be able to purify the Nazir on the 7th day. He goes to the mikvah, it's full yom now. He walks up to the gates but doesn't enter, and we do the karbanos. So obviously, it would be wrong to interpret from the pasuk that the fact that it says Bayom Hashmini means that it's only then that he's permitted to enter, because a Nazir is clearly permitted. A Nazir Tameh is clearly permitted to enter even on the 7th day or on the 4th day, for that matter. Right, because he doesn't have to go to the mikvah. He could be Tameh Mace and walk up to the front gates. So the fact that we're saying that he comes in front of the front gates, in front of the gates, doesn't mean that until that point he wasn't permitted to come in, because Nazir clearly indicates he would be able to come in. Abai says, it's a unique rule. One second. Abai says that the full yom of Zav still gives you the tumah of Zav. Vafilu hachi, but Zav is different. And why is that? Keeping the mechutz kapara loyal, because a Zav, the process to become pure requires a carbon. So therefore, he cannot enter the temple until he brings that carbon. He's sometimes called a mechutz kippurim, mechutz kapara. It's not really a tumah. It's the fact that in order to go into the temple, he needs to bring a sacrifice.
The Mitzvah did not need a sacrifice.
A Mitzvah is not, in this case, is not a Tumah Yetzim in that sense. I'm sorry, no. He's called Mechutz Kippurim until he's ready to bring the carbon, meaning he goes to the mikvah.
Right.
Once he goes to the mikvah, the next day he can bring his carbon,
Right.
which is the case by Zav as well.
Oh.
And then he can enter to bring, but until he finishes his Tumah Zav and then he goes to the mikvah, he can't enter Machna Leviah either. Okay, so in other words, when we talk about in front of the temple, we don't mean in the courtyard. We mean on the 7th day, the 8th day, he's able to enter in front of the courtyard. In other words, in the area before the courtyard and in the Ezras Nashim, before the gates of Niknar, or outside of the gates of Niknar. Okay, so if that's the case, why are we calling Machna Leviah Oyel Moed? The tent of meeting. Why are we calling it the Beis HaMikdash if it's really outside? It's a step removed from the Beis HaMikdash. So the Gemara says, Ma hasam to tell me Ma hasam mechutz kippurim le'ayal after lemachna leviah mechutz kapara loy ayal. Just like to the temple, somebody who's Tumah Zav cannot enter the temple. Somebody who's the Beis HaMikdash, somebody who is also a Zav cannot enter Machna Leviah either. Okay, and how do we know we can't go into the Beis HaMikdash? Tanya, we learned Tameh Yia l'Rav is Tful Yom. This is a prohibition for him to enter the temple. He is Tameh, that comes to include a Tful Yom. Oituma Sebayin l'Rav is Mechutz Kapara. A Tful Yom is now not allowed to enter the temple, and neither is a person who's Mechutz Kippurim, somebody who's missing his sacrifice and hasn't gone to the mikveh yet. That person is not just prohibited to go into the Beis HaMikdash, but he's also prohibited to go into the Machna Leviah either. That's the area surrounding the Beis HaMikdash. He can't go in the Temple Mount, basically. Okay. Mishnah. Tagalachatz tahara ketzad. So somebody somebody is a Nazir, he's becoming pure, he has to shave his head. What happens? Kate said, he brings 3 animals, chatas, oil of shlamim. 3 animals we saw previously, chatas and oil of shlamim. The shechet as a shlamim megalech alem. He takes the shlamim, and the shlamim is a carbon that's split. He's going to eat some of it, and most of it's going to go on the altar for God. Kain gets a little bit also. And then he cuts his hair. Rabbi Yehudah, this is the opinion of Rabbi Yehudah. Rabbi Lazar says, Rabbi Lazar says he would first slaughter the chatos and then cut his hair. Chatos is always the first sacrifice to be brought. If somebody's bringing multiple sacrifices at the same time, the chatos comes first. But ultimately, if he brought even any one of the karbonos and then he cut his hair, he fulfills the obligation. Rav Shimon Gamliel said, "Hevi gimel behemoths v'loy pirush." If he brings 3 animals, now, like we said before, what is it? The oila is a male offering. Shlomim and chatas are both females. Shlomim is over a year old. Chatas is under a year old. So none of these animals could be the same animal. They all have to be 3 different animals. So if a guy brings 3 animals and doesn't explain, then we figure out, the female under a year is lachatas. The male is tikra chatas, tikra chatas la'olah. The male is going to be la'olah. Tikra viola, it's brought as an olah. And l'shlomim, that would be the female that's over a year old, will be brought as a shlomim. The Nazir cuts his hair in front of the oil mayat. Okay, now the words in front of the oil mayat are also used to describe the shlomim that the Nazir brings. But it's interesting to note, if anyone has the fancy Gemara, so you look at the side of the page, the entire verse actually tells you that it's a shlomim. The verse says as follows: "V'gilach hanazir pesach ha'omayed." The Nazir cuts his hair in front of the Beis Hamikdash. It's Rosh Nizrei, his head. V'lokach hasar Rosh Nizrei. You take the hair. V'nosan ala eish. You put it on the fire. Asher tachas zevach hashlomim. That's underneath the sacrifice of shlomim. So the verse actually tells you that it's talking about shlomim. But it's not clear because it could be talking about other animals too, because it says zevach. Zevach means sacrifices. And zevach comes to include chatas and asham as well, the chatas and oila as well. So therefore, this first author prefers to say that because it says oil mayed, and in the case of, and when the Torah describes the Nazir bringing the shlomim, it also says oil mayed. That proves b'shlom hakasim daber shneimar b'shachtu pesach mayed. Because when you bring a shlomim, it says you slaughter it pesach mayed. So that's how we know we're talking about shlomim here. You're telling me that it's shlomim, that you bring karban shlomim. Maybe it means that you bring it literally in front of the Beis Hamikdash. I'm sorry, meaning that the Nazir we bring the Nazir into the temple, we set up the barber chair right in front of the opening of the temple, and we cut his hair right over there. Maybe that's what it means. So where it says Am Kain Amrit, if that's the case, Im Kain Derech B'Zayinhu. It's sort of embarrassing to take a haircut right in front of the temple. So Rav Yeshua, it's not clear if we add this text in. There's another variation of the text which we'll skip, but it's roughly speaking the same idea. Rav Yeshua, it's not necessary. So Rav Yeshua says it can't be. So in other words, maybe it can't be that the Torah says that you should actually cut your hair in front of the temple, in front of the Beis Hamikdash. Why? Because you're not allowed to walk up the altar cannot have steps. Why? Because as they're walking, their robes can move, and it would be sort of unsightly. If that type of unsightliness is prohibited, then certainly taking a haircut on a barber chair in front of the Beis Hamikdash is also prohibited. So yeah, so it must be that it must be that the pasuk is not actually referring to taking haircut in front of the Beis Hamikdash, but it's referring to take a haircut and put it underneath the carbon where it says in front of the Beis Hamikdash, which is a carbon shlom. Okay. You can skip the brackets. It's just it's the same Gemara basically without Rabbi Yehudah. Some have the version, the variation of the text is same Gemara, except the Gemara says it on its own. It doesn't need to bring Rabbi Yehudah. Okay. And you can just skip the next few lines. Rabbi Yitzchak says, "Ain't it tzarich? It's not necessary to prove from Pesach HaMayit." Harei Omer, the pasuk says, you take the hair and you put it on the fire.
It's a true barbecue. Oh,
That's for you, Cutners.
The hair has to be that you cut the hair and immediately you put it underneath the fire. Okay, now the oila and the chatos are what we call katshe kachim, meaning that the entire sacrificial service must be performed in that courtyard. So we said there's the temple building itself called the Beis Hamikdash that has two rooms, right? There's the katshe kachim where the Ark of the Covenant was, the Aron HaBris, and then there's the front room, which is called the Kodesh or the Heichal. That's the structure. That's the building. The building was in a courtyard called the Azara. That has, a Jew is allowed to walk into the Azara, but he's not allowed to walk into the temple. Okay, now, katshe kachim, the high level sacrifices, which would be an oila and a chatos and an asham, they need to be brought in the Azara. They're eaten in the Azara. They cannot leave the Azara. If they leave the Azara, they're burnt. Can't eat it anymore. However, kachim kalim, what we call light sacrifices, one of them would be a shlomim, but there's others as well. A lighter sanctification, you can eat it in the entire city of Jerusalem. So obviously, if the Nazir is cutting his hair outside the temple, because like we said, it's wholly inappropriate for him to be literally in the front steps. So he's outside the Azara. He's actually in the Ezras Nashim. Not only that, in the second temple, in the Ezras Nashim, they built a room called the Nazir room. Lishkas HaNazir. The Nazir room was the room where all the Nazirim they'd have pots and pans and they'd have fires and they'd burn a lot of fire. So now, if the Nazir is cutting his hair in the Nazir room, probably had barber chairs too, then presumably, and it says they take his hair and they put it underneath the fire. That means the fire with the meat is in the room ready to go. Not that you have to go bring it into the Beis Hamikdash. Because if it was in the other sacrifices, the chatas and the oila, you'd have to bring it into the Beis Hamikdash to use it. Because those were not allowed to leave. You had to cook them in the Beis Hamikdash itself, in the Azara. So therefore, the fact that Torah says v'lokach v'nasan, you cut his hair and you put it underneath the fire, indicates that you don't have to carry it somewhere else, and that must mean it's referring to the shlom. If it was referring to the oila or the chatos, you'd need to bring it. And the verse doesn't say anything about bringing, so presumably it's not referring to the chatas. Another version is Rabbi Yitzchak says b'shlom hakasav medaber. The Torah is talking about shlom. It means that you put it. It means that you slaughter the shlomim first and then get a haircut. Or maybe it means you literally take the haircut in front of the Beis Hamikdash. Talmud leimer v'lokach chasar nazir. You take the hair of the Nazir. So you take the hair and you put it on the fire, meaning it happens in the same place. Oh, where does that happen? It must be it happens outside the temple.
We're saying the temple is
In front of the temple means the Azara. The Azara is the courtyard that surrounds the temple structure.
Okay, so that's not on the mount.
That is on the mount. So that there sort of the levels of purity are there is Jerusalem,
right,
and then there is the Temple Mount.
Okay.
And the modern day Temple Mount is comprised of two areas: the traditional Temple Mount, plus an extension, the Herodian extension. The Herodian extension is not sanctified, but there is no line between the Herodian extension and the ancient structure. It's not as if sort of there's a ridge line and or like a painted red on the floor. Not like that. And that's why, even though technically speaking, you would be permitted to enter the Herodian structure, the Herodian Temple Mount, but you probably wouldn't know. There's no demarcation line to know where exactly you're going on, and therefore it's highly recommended that you avoid going on the Temple Mount. Despite the fact that there are some religious Jews that go, and there are no well-respected rabbis that sanction such behavior. Anyway, be that as it may, the traditional Temple Mount is the next level of sanctification. So, in other words, if you're a Mitzvah, you stay outside Jerusalem. If you're not a Mitzvah, anyone else can go into Jerusalem. If you're a Tumah Yotzei Min HaGuf, Zav Nida Yeledes, you stay outside the Beis HaMikdash. You stay outside the Temple Mount. If you're a Tamei Meis, you may enter. And then on the Temple Mount, there's sort of this, how do you say it? This elevated platform. Okay, it's a huge platform. It takes up probably about a quarter of the Temple Mount. And on that platform is built, so it's elevated. You got to walk up a couple of steps. And on that platform is built the outer room, which is not sanctified. That's called the Ezras Nashim. Same level of sanctification as the rest of the Temple Mount. Okay. Except rabbinically, maybe they didn't advise people that were impure to go in. But that's a side note. But technically speaking, it doesn't have sanctification. And then there is on that platform, so you have the Nazir room is built. That's on the non-sanctified portion. And on the sanctified portion, you have the Azara. That's the courtyard of the temple itself, and the temple structure itself built on top of the platform. So basically what we're saying here is that where you're cooking the sacrifice, which is going to be outside the Beis HaMikdash, outside the Azara, it's going to be in the Ezras Nashim, the women's section, or in that room called the Lishkas and Nazirim. That's where you get the haircut. Abachanan Aimer Mishum Rabbi Eliezer. Abachanan says the name of Rabbi Eliezer. The Gilach HaNazir Pesach Oil Moed. The Nazir will cut his hair in front of the Oil Moed, in front of the Beis HaMikdash. Kolzman she'ein Pesach Oil Moed Pasuach Ein Megalech. He says what it actually means is the gates of Niknar have to actually, the gates of the Beis HaMikdash have to actually be open. So every night the gates were all closed. There's a whole procedure how the gates were open. If anyone learned Masechtas Midas or Talmud, there's a procedure how the gates were open every single day. But basically the point is, once the gates are closed, you cannot cut your hair. The gates have to actually be open. Okay. Reb Shimon Shazuri comes with the most obvious reference. He says, "V'gilach hanazir pesach oyel moed." 1 second. No, I'm sorry. It's the next one. V'loy nazira. Only a nazir cuts his hair in the lishkas hanazirim in front of the on the Temple Mount, but a nazira, a woman who's a nazir, does not. Okay, v'loy nazira. Why? Shema yizgaru ba perchi kahuna. Because we're concerned that the teenagers are going to be attracted to her, so therefore she does not cut her hair in the Beis HaMikdash, meaning on the Temple Mount, in that room. The Lishkas Nazir. So they said to him, if that's the case, then we have another problem. If you have a woman who's a saita, it says the saita, she is part of the process to determine if she's an adulteress or not. She has to ensure her hair is uncovered, and her upper part of her shirt is ripped and tied. They tie it above. They tie her. Her upper shirt is ripped and it's tied above her breast with rope. We'll get to it in the next Masechta. Okay, and why don't we say also that should be done outside the Beis HaMikdash? Shemi's garba perfect kahuna. Maybe the teenagers will be staring at her. So Gemara says, Amar lahen zu kechelas b'sekes zu eni kechelas b'sekes. The woman who's in a zira presumably is made up and she's she looks good, and whereas the woman who's a saita does not look good, and therefore there's no concern that they will be aroused by her. Okay, Mishnah Mem Hayim and Beis. First Mishnah. You take the hair of the Nazir and you put it underneath in the pot. Now sometimes a Nazir could choose to send money to the temple. Let's say he lives in Bavel. He could send the money, and when the guy comes back and says the sacrifices were brought, then he can go ahead and cut his hair in Bavel. He doesn't actually have to go to the temple. Now, if he does that, his hair doesn't need to be burned.
Just cuts it and tosses it.
Just cuts it and tosses it. And we'll see. We'll see. Maybe he actually can't toss it. Maybe he has to do something else to it. We'll get to it. Okay. He didn't burn it. When is it said? If he's cutting his hair because he's pure and he's ending his nazirus. But if he's tamei and he's cutting his hair because of that, he would not put his hair underneath, in the fire. Rameir says that everybody would put their hair in the fire, except for a person who is tamei in outside of Israel. So if he lived in Bavel and he became tamei and he sent money for his koronos, then he obviously has to shave his hair and start again. He would not burn his hair. Okay, let's start the Gemara. He takes the hair of his nazirus. We learned. So that you have the meat that's cooking on the pot, right, or grilling on the pot, something like that. And what you do is you take some of the sauce of the meat and you put it in the fire, because the pasuk says, where is it? Expiration is right. He cuts his head of hair. He takes the hair. He puts it on the fire. That's under the zevach shlomim. That's under the sacrifice. From there we see that the sacrifice also has to go under as well. So some small amount of the sacrifice has to be burnt. And you take some of the sauce of the sacrifice, you put it on top of the hair, you put it all into the fire, underneath the pot. And if you ended up taking the hair of the Nazir, carrying it into the temple and putting it underneath the chatos, or in the case of a Nazir tamei, he also brings an asham, yotzi, fulfill your obligation. So Gemara says, asham Nazir Torah miyeka. Is there an asham by a Nazir Torah? There isn't. Similarly, if he was a Nazir tamei and he put it underneath the fire of the asham, he also fulfills his obligation. What about the oila? The oila isn't eaten, so it's not relevant, right? The oila, the entire animal is burnt on the altar, so therefore it's not a relevant question. Okay. Something. I think we'll stop here. Yeah. Otherwise I'll leave you hanging. So stop here, and tomorrow we'll continue from going through what's the source of the shlomim, the fact that you fulfill the obligation with the chatas and a zevach, and that you take some of the right of some of the sauce and put it in. So we'll just briefly summarize here. We started off by exploring why a zav go to the mikvah before and wait for sunset before he brings his karbanos. We contrasted that fact that the zav is not able to enter the temple until after he goes to the mikvah. The temple mount. The zav cannot enter the temple mount until he goes to the mikvah and he's ready to bring the sacrifice. Whereas a Nazir tamei, or anyone else who's tamei for that matter, is allowed to enter the temple mount. Okay, we saw the debate about which sacrifice allows the Nazir to cut his hair, whether it's the shlomim or whether it's the chatas. We pointed out that the Gemara brought a bunch of supports for the opinion of shlomim, a bunch of different psukim to support the notion that when the Torah says the Nazir cuts his hair, either because it says Pesach al Mayid and the in front of the Beis Hamikdash, which is what it says by shlomim, or it's because if he's cutting his hair, he has to be able to immediately burn it, etc. We gave a bunch of different reasons how we know that the shlom is the first sacrifice to be brought, and that's when the Nazir cuts his hair and he dumps it underneath the pot of shlom. And then we saw the Mishnah, we saw just now, which is you take the hair, you put it underneath the pot. We have a debate. What about if you're not in the Beis Hamikdash? Do you need to need to burn the hair or not? We'll talk more about that tomorrow, and then we finished off with the last Gemara, which is that you can put it under if you took the hair and burnt it underneath the chatos, or in a case of Nazir Tameh underneath the shlom, the asham, that would also work as well. And you also need to take some of the sacrifice and put it into the fire as well, and burn it, the liquids. Gravy, right.